Hi, I'm Andrea Mackenzie, reading Chapter 4 of L.M. Montgomery's Jane of Lantern Hill. Of course, it was no time before grandmother knew about Jody. She made a great many sweetly sarcastic speeches about her, but she never actually forbade Jane going over to play with her in the yard of 58. Jane was to be a good many years older before she understood the reason for that. Understood that grandmother wanted to show anyone who might question it that Jane had common tastes and liked low people. "Darling, is this Jody of yours a nice little girl?" Mother had asked doubtfully. "She is a very nice little girl," said Jane emphatically. "But she looks so uncared for, positively dirty." "Her face is always clean, and she never forgets to wash behind her ears, Mummy. I'm going to show her how to wash her hair. Her hair would be lovely if it was clean. It's so fine and black and silky. And may I give her one of my jars of cold cream? I've two, you know. For her hands, they're so red and chapped because she has to work so hard and wash so many dishes. But her clothes? She can't help her clothes. She just has to wear what's given her, and she never has more than 2 dresses at a time. One to wear every day and one to go to Sunday school in. Even the Sunday school one isn't very clean. It was Mrs. Ballew's Ethel's old pink one, and she spilled coffee on it. And she has to work so hard. She's a regular little slave, Mary says. I like Jody very much, Mummy. She's sweet." "Well," Mother sighed and gave way. Mother always gave way if you were firm enough. Jane had already discovered that. She adored Mother, but she had unerringly laid her finger on the weak spot in her character. Mother couldn't stand up to people. Jane had heard Mary say that to Frank one time when they didn't think she had heard, and she knew it was true. "She'll go with the last one that talks to her," said Mary, "and that's always the old lady." "Well, the old lady's mighty good to her," said Frank. "She's a gay little piece." "Gay enough. But is she happy?" said Mary. "Happy? Of course Mummy is happy," Jane had thought indignantly. All the more indignantly because away back in her mind there was lurking a queer suspicion that Mother, in spite of her dances and dinners and furs and dresses and jewels and friends, wasn't happy. Jane couldn't imagine why she had this idea. Perhaps a look in Mother's eyes now and then, like something shut up in a cage. Jane could go over and play in the yard of 58 in the spring and summer evenings after Jody had finished washing stacks of dishes. They made their imaginary garden. They fed crumbs to the robins and the black and gray squirrels. They sat up in the cherry tree and watched the evening star together. And talked. Jane, who could never find anything to say to Phyllis, found plenty to say to Jody. There was never any question of Jody coming to play in the yard of 60. Once, early in their friendship, Jane had asked Jody to come over. She had found Jody crying under the cherry tree again, and discovered that it was because Miss West had insisted on her putting her old teddy bear in the garbage pail. It was, Miss West said, utterly worn out. It had been patched until there was no more room for patches, and even shoe buttons couldn't be sewn any more into its worn-out eye sockets. Besides, she was too old to be playing with teddy bears. "But I've nothing else," sobbed Jody. "If I had a doll, I wouldn't mind. I've always wanted a doll. But now I'll have to sleep alone away up there, and it's so lonesome." "Come over to our house and I'll give you a doll," said Jane. Jane had never cared much for dolls because they were not alive. She had a very nice one which Aunt Sylvia had given her the Christmas she was 7, but it was so flawless and well-dressed that it never needed to have anything done for it, and Jane had never loved it. She would have loved better a teddy bear that needed a new patch every day. She took Jody, wide-eyed and enraptured, through the splendors of 60 Gay and gave her the doll, which had reposed undisturbed for a long time in the lower drawer of the huge black wardrobe in Jane's room. Then she had taken her into Mother's room to show her the things on Mother's table. The silver-backed brushes, the perfume bottles with the cut glass stoppers that made rainbows, the wonderful rings on the little gold tray. Grandmother found them there. She stood in the doorway and looked at them. You could feel the silence spreading through the room like a cold, smothering wave. "What does this mean, Victoria, if I am allowed to ask?" "This is Jody," faltered Jane. "I brought her over to give her my doll. She hasn't any." "Indeed? And you have given her the one your Aunt Sylvia gave you?" Jane at once realized that she had done something quite unpardonable. It had never occurred to her that she was not at liberty to give away her own doll. "I have not," said Grandmother, "forbidden you to play with this Jody in her own lot. What is in the blood is bound to come out sooner or later. But, if you don't mind, please don't bring your riffraff here, my dear Victoria." Her dear Victoria got herself and poor hurt Jody away as best she could, leaving the doll behind them. But Grandmother did not get off scot-free for all that. For the first time, the worm turned. Jane paused for a moment before she went out of the door and looked straight at Grandmother with intent, judging brown eyes. "You are not fair," she said. Her voice trembled a little, but she felt she had to say it, no matter how impertinent Grandmother thought her. Then she followed Jody down and out with a strange feeling of satisfaction in her heart. "I ain't riffraff," said Jody, her lips quivering. "Of course I'm not like you. Miss West says you're people. But my folks were respectable. Cousin Millie told me so. She said they always paid their way when they were alive. And I work hard enough for Miss West to pay my way." "You aren't riffraff, and I love you," said Jane. "You and Mother are the only people in the whole world I love." Even as she said it, a queer little pang wrung Jane's heart. It suddenly occurred to her that two people out of all the millions in the world— Jane never could remember the exact number of millions, but she knew it was enormous— were very few to love. "And I like loving people," thought Jane. "It's nice." "I don't love anybody but you," said Jody, who forgot her hurt feelings as soon as Jane got her interested in building a castle out of all the old tin cans in the corner of the yard. Miss West hoarded her tin cans for a country cousin who made some mysterious use of them. He had not been in all winter, and there were enough cans to build a towering structure. Dick kicked it down next day, of course, but they had had the fun of building it. They never knew that Mr. Torrey, one of the 58 boarders who is a budding architect, saw the castle gleaming in the moonlight when he was putting his car in the garage and whistled over it. "That's rather an amazing thing for those two kids to build," he said. Jane, who should have been asleep, was lying wide awake that very moment, going on with the story of her life in the moon, which she could see through her window. Jane's moon secret, as she called it, was the one thing she hadn't shared with Mother and Jody. She couldn't, somehow. It was her very own. To tell about it would be to destroy it. For 3 years now, Jane had been going on dream voyages to the moon. It was a shimmering world of fancy where she lived very splendidly and sated some deep thirst in her soul at unknown enchanted springs among its shining silver hills. Before she had found the trick of going to the moon, Jane had longed to get into the looking-glass as Alice did. She used to stand so long before her mirror, hoping for the miracle to happen, that Aunt Gertrude said Victoria was the vainest child she had ever seen. "Really?" said Grandmother, as if mildly inquiring what Jane could possibly have to be vain about. Eventually, Jane had sadly concluded that she could never get into the looking-glass world, and then one night, when she was lying alone in her big, unfriendly room, she saw the moon looking in at her through one of the windows. The calm, beautiful moon that was never in a hurry, and she began to build for herself an existence in the moon, where she ate fairy food and wandered through fairy fields full of strange white moon blossoms with the companions of her fancy. But even in the moon, Jane's dreams ran true to the ruling passion. Since the moon was all silver, it had to be polished every night. Jane and her moon friends had no end of fun polishing up the moon, with an elaborate system of rewards and punishments for extra good polishers and lazy ones. The lazy ones were generally banished to the other side of the moon, which, Jane had read, was very dark and very cold. When they were allowed back, chilled to the bone, they were glad to warm themselves up by rubbing as hard as they could. Those were the nights when the moon seemed brighter than usual. Oh, it was fun! Jane was never lonely in bed now, except on nights when there was no moon. The dearest sight Jane knew was the thin crescent in the western sky that told her her friend was back. She was supported through many a dreary day by the hope of going on a moon spree at night. That ends Chapter 4 of Jane of Lantern Hill. Thanks for listening, and see you again. Hi, I'm Andrea Mackenzie, and I'm reading from a block north of Bloor Street in Toronto. If you hear background noise, it's probably the clangor of Bloor Street traffic outside. It is still a main thoroughfare, just as it was in Jane's day. Chapter 5 of Jane of Lantern Hill by L.M. Montgomery. Up to the age of 10, Jane had believed her father was dead. She could not recall that anybody had ever told her so, but if she had thought about it at all, she would have felt quite sure of it. She just did not think about it. Nobody ever mentioned him. All she knew about him was that his name must have been Andrew Stewart because Mother was Mrs. Andrew Stewart. For anything else, he might as well never have existed as far as Jane was concerned. She did not know much about fathers. The only one she was really acquainted with was Phyllis's father, Uncle David Coleman, a handsome, oldish man with pouches under his eyes, who grunted at her occasionally when he came to Sunday dinners. Jane had an idea his grunts were meant to be friendly, and she did not dislike him, but there was nothing about him that made her envy Phyllis for having a father. With a mother so sweet and adorable and loving, what did one want of a father? Then Agnes Ripley came to St. Agatha's. Jane liked Agnes well enough at first, though Agnes had stuck her tongue out at Jane rather derisively on the occasion of their first meeting. She was the daughter of somebody who was called the Great Thomas Ripley. He had built railroads and things, and most of the St. Agatha's girls paid court to her and plumed themselves if she noticed them. She was much given to secrets, and it came to be thought a great honor among the St. Agathians if Agnes told you a secret. Therefore, Jane was conscious of a decided thrill when one afternoon on the playground, Agnes came up to her and said darkly and mysteriously, "I know a secret." "I know a secret" is probably the most intriguing phrase in the world. Jane surrendered to its allure. "Oh, tell me," she implored. She wanted to be admitted to that charmed inner circle of girls who had been told one of Agnes' secrets, and she wanted to know the secret for its own sake. Secrets must always be wonderful, beautiful things. Agnes wrinkled up her fat little nose and looked important. "Oh, I'll tell you some other time." "I don't want to hear it some other time. I want to hear it now," pleaded Jane, her marigold eyes full of eager radiance. Agnes' little elfish face, framed in its straight brown hair, was alive with mischief. She winked one of her green eyes at Jane. "All right. Don't blame me if you don't like it when you hear it. Listen." Jane listened. The towers of St. Agatha's listened. The shabby streets beyond listened. It seemed to Jane that the whole world listened. She was one of the chosen. Agnes was going to tell her a secret. "Your father and mother don't live together." Jane stared at Agnes. What she had said didn't make any sense. "Of course they don't live together," she said. "My father is dead." "Oh, no, he isn't," said Agnes. "He's living down in Prince Edward Island. Your mother left him when you were 3 years old." Jane felt as if some big cold hand were beginning to squeeze her heart. "That isn't true," she gasped. "'Tis too. I heard Aunt Dora telling Mother all about it. She said your mother married him just after he came back from the war, one summer when your grandmother took her down to the Maritimes. Your grandmother didn't want her to. Aunt Dora said everybody knew it wouldn't last long. He was poor. But it was you that made the most trouble. You should never have been born. Neither of them wanted you, Aunt Dora said. They fought like cat and dog after that, and at last your mother just up and left him. Aunt Dora said she would likely have divorced him, only divorces are awful hard to get in Canada, and anyhow, all the Kennedys think divorce is a dreadful thing." The hand was gripping Jane's heart so tightly now that she could hardly breathe. I don't believe it," she said. "If that's how you're going to talk when I tell you a secret, I'll never tell you another one, Miss Victoria Stewart," said Agnes, reddening with rage. "I don't want to hear any more," said Jane. She would never forget what she had heard. It couldn't be true. It couldn't. Jane thought the afternoon would never end. St. Agatha's was a nightmare. Frank had never driven so slowly home. The snow had never looked so grimy and dirty along the dingy streets. The wind had never been so gray. The moon, floating high in the sky, was all faded and paper white, but Jane didn't care if it was never polished again. An afternoon tea was in progress at 60 Gay when she arrived there. The big drawing room, decorated lavishly with pale pink snapdragons and tulips and maidenhair fern, was full of people. Mother, in orchid chiffon with loose trailing lace sleeves, was laughing and chatting. Grandmother, with blue-white diamonds sparkling in her hair, was sitting on her favorite needlepoint chair, looking, so one lady said, such an utterly sweet silver-haired thing, just like a Whistler mother. Aunt Gertrude and Aunt Sylvia were pouring tea at a table covered with Venetian lace, where tall pink tapers were burning. Straight through them all, Jane marched to Mother. She did not care how many people were there. She had one question to ask, and it must be answered at once. At once. Jane could not bear her suspense another moment. "Mummy," she said, "is my father alive?" A strange, dreadful hush suddenly fell over the room. A light like a sword flashed into Grandmother's blue eyes. Aunt Sylvia gasped and Aunt Gertrude turned an unbecoming purple. But Mother's face was as if snow had fallen over it. "Is he?" said Jane. "Yes," said Mother. She said nothing more. Jane asked nothing more. She turned and went out and up the stairs blindly. In her own room, she shut the door and lay down very softly on the big white bearskin rug by the bed, her face buried in the soft fur. Heavy black waves of pain seemed rolling over her. So it was true. All her life she had thought her father dead while he was living, on that faraway dot on the map which she had been told was the province of Prince Edward Island. But he and Mother did not like each other, and she had not been wanted. Jane found that it was a very curious and unpleasant sensation to feel that your parents hadn't wanted you. She was sure that all the rest of her life she would hear Agnes' voice saying, "You should never have been born." She hated Agnes Ripley. She would always hate her. Jane wondered if she would live to be as old as Grandmother, and how she could bear it if she did. Mother and Grandmother found her there when everybody had gone. "Victoria, get up." Jane did not move. "Victoria, I am accustomed to being obeyed when I speak." Jane got up. She had not cried. Hadn't somebody ages ago said that Jane never cried? But her face was stamped with an expression that might have wrung anybody's heart. Perhaps it touched even Grandmother, for she said, quite gently for her, "I have always told your mother, Victoria, that she ought to tell you the truth. I told her you were sure to hear it from someone sooner or later. Your father is living. Your mother married him against my wish and lived to repent it. I forgave her and welcomed her back gladly when she came to her senses. That is all. And in future, when you feel an irresistible urge to make a scene while we are entertaining, will you be good enough to control the impulse until our guests are gone?" "Why didn't he like me?" asked Jane, dully. When all was said and done, that seemed to be what was hurting most. Her mother might not have wanted her either to begin with, but Jane knew that Mother loved her now. Mother suddenly gave a little laugh, so sad that it nearly broke Jane's heart. "He was jealous of you, I think," she said. "He made your mother's life wretched," said Grandmother, her voice hardening. "Oh, I was to blame too," cried Mother chokingly. Jane, looking from one to the other, saw the swift change that came over Grandmother's face. "You will never mention your father's name in my hearing or in your mother's hearing again," said Grandmother. "As far as we are concerned, as far as you are concerned, he is dead." The prohibition was unnecessary. Jane didn't want to mention her father's name again. He had made Mother unhappy, and so Jane hated him and put him out of her thoughts completely. There were just some things that didn't bear thinking of, and Father was one of them. But the most terrible thing about it all was that there was something now that could not be talked over with Mother. Jane felt it between them, indefinable, but there. The old perfect confidence was gone. There was a subject that must never be mentioned, and it poisoned everything. She could never bear Agnes Ripley and her cult of secrets again, and was glad when Agnes left the school, the great Thomas having decided that it was not quite up to date enough for his daughter. Agnes wanted to learn tap dancing. That ends Chapter 5. Thanks for listening, and see you again.
Hi, my name is Heather Kilner, and I live in Toronto, and I am reading Chapter 6, which talks about Jane in Toronto and her love of streetcars. And I live in the heart of Parkdale, right on Queen Street, and I have a streetcar running under my windows all the time. And I currently am in Sarnia, which is where I am from, and in my original bedroom I found my original copy of Jane. And I hope you enjoy my reading. Thanks. Bye. Chapter 6, Part 1. It was a year now since Jane had learned that she had a father. A year in which Jane had just scraped by as far as her grade was concerned. Phyllis had taken the prize for general proficiency in her year, and did Jane hear of it? Had continued to be driven to and from St. Agatha's, had tried her best to like Phyllis, and had not made any great headway at it, had trysted with Jody in the backyard twilights, and had practiced her scales as faithfully as if she liked it. "Such a pity you are not fonder of music," said Grandmother, "but of course, how could you be?" It was not so much what Grandmother said as how she said it. She made wounds that rankled and festered. Jane was fond of music. She loved to listen to it. When Mr. Ransom, the musical boarder at 58, played on his violin in his room in the evenings, he never dreamed of the two enraptured listeners he had in the backyard cherry tree. Jane and Jody sat there, their hands clasped, their hearts filled with some nameless ecstasy. When winter came and the bedroom window was shut, Jane felt the loss keenly. The moon was her only escape then, and she slipped away to it oftener than ever, in long visitations of silence, which Grandmother called sulks. "She has a very sulky disposition," said Grandmother. "Oh, I don't think so," faltered Mother. The only time she ever dared to contradict Grandmother were in defense of Jane. "She's just rather sensitive." Sensitive! Grandmother laughed. Grandmother did not often laugh, which Jane thought was just as well. As for Aunt Gertrude, if she ever laughed or jested, it must have been so long ago that no one remembered it. Mother laughed when people were about, little tinkling laughs that Jane could never feel were real. No, there was not much real laughter at 60 Gay, though Jane, with her concealed gift for seeing the funny side of things, could have filled even that big house with laughter. But Jane had known very early that Grandmother resented laughter. Even Mary and Frank had to giggle very discreetly in the kitchen. Jane had shot up appallingly in that year. She was rather more angular and awkward. Her chin was square and cleft. "Gets more like his every day," she once heard her grandmother saying bitterly to Aunt Gertrude. Jane winced. In her bitter new wisdom, she suspected that his was her father's chin, and she straightway detested hers. Why couldn't it have been the pretty rounded one like her mother's? The year was uneventful. Jane would have called it monotonous if she had not yet been unacquainted with the word. There were only 3 things in it that made much impression on her: the incident of the kitten, the mysterious affair of Kenneth Howard's picture, and the unlucky recitation. Jane had picked up a kitten in the street. One afternoon, Frank had been in a big hurry to get somewhere on time for Grandmother and Mother, and he let Jane walk home from the beginning of Gay Street when he was bringing her from St. Agatha's. Jane walked along happily, savoring this rare moment of independence. It was very seldom she was allowed to walk anywhere alone, to walk anywhere at all indeed. And Jane loved walking. She would have liked to walk to and from St. Agatha's, or, since it really was too far, she would have liked to go by streetcar. Jane loved traveling on a streetcar. It was so fascinating to look at the people in it and speculate about them. Who was the lady with the lovely shimmering hair? What was the angry woman muttering to herself about? Did that little boy like having his mother clean his face with her handkerchief in public? Did that jolly-looking girl have trouble getting her grade? Did that man have a toothache, and did he ever look pleasant when he hadn't it? She would have liked to have known all about them and sympathize or rejoice as occasion required, but it was very seldom any resident of 60 Gay had a chance to go on a streetcar. There was always Frank with the limousine. Jane walked slowly to prolong the pleasure. It was a cold day in late autumn. It had been miserly of its light from the beginning, with a dim ghost of sun peering through the dull grey clouds, and now it was getting dark and spitting snow. The lights gleamed out. Even in the grim windows of Victorian Gay were abloom. Jane did not mind the bitter wind, but something else did. Jane heard the most pitiful, despairing little cry, and looked down to see the kitten huddled miserably against the iron fence. She bent and picked it up and held it against her face. The little creature, a handful of tiny bones in its fluffed-out Maltese fur, licked her cheek with an eager tongue. It was cold, starving, forsaken. Jane knew it did not belong to Gay Street. She could not leave it there to perish in the oncoming stormy night. "Goodness sake, Miss Victoria, wherever did you get that?" exclaimed Mary when Jane entered the kitchen. "You shouldn't have brought it in. You know your grandmother doesn't like cats. Your Aunt Gertrude got one once, but it clawed all the tassels off the furniture and it had to go. Better put that kitten out right now, Miss Victoria." Jane hated to be called Miss Victoria, but grandmother insisted on the servants addressing her so. "I can't put it out in the cold, Mary. Let me give it some supper and leave it here till after dinner. I'll ask grandmother to let me keep it. Perhaps she will if I promise to keep it out of hearing in the yard. You wouldn't mind it round, would you, Mary?" "I'd like it," said Mary. "I'd often thought a cat would be great company, or a dog. Your mother had a dog once, but it got poisoned, and she said she would never have another." Mary did not tell Jane that she firmly believed the old lady had poisoned the dog. You didn't tell children things like that, and anyway, she couldn't be dead sure of it. All she was sure of was that old Mrs. Kennedy had been bitterly jealous of her daughter's love for the dog. "How she used to look at it when she didn't know I saw her," thought Mary. Grandmother and Aunt Gertrude and Mother were taking in a couple of teas that day, so Jane knew she could count on at least an hour yet. It was a pleasant hour. The kitten was happy and frolicsome, having drunk milk, and its little sides tubbed out almost to the bursting point. The kitchen was warm and cozy. Mary let Jane chop nuts that were to be sprinkled over the cake, and cut pears into slim segments for the salad. "Oh, Mary, blueberry pie! Why don't we have it oftener? You make such delicious blueberry pie." "Well, there's some that can make pies and some who can't," said Mary complacently. "As for having it oftener, you know your grandmother doesn't care much for any kind of pie. She says they're indigestible. And my father lived to be 90 and had pie for breakfast every morning of his life. I just make it occasionally for your mother." "After dinner, I'll tell grandmother about the kitten and ask if I may keep it," said Jane. "I think you'll have your troubles for your pains, you poor child," Mary said as the door closed behind Jane. "Miss Robin ought to stand up for you more than she does. But there, she's always been under the thumbs of her mother. Anyway, I hope dinner will go well and keep the old dame in good humor. I wished I hadn't made that blueberry pie after all. It's lucky she won't know Miss Victoria fixed the salad. And what folks know never hurts them." The dinner did not go well. There was tension in the air. Grandmother did not talk. Evidently some occurrence of the afternoon had put her out. Aunt Gertrude never talked at any time. And Mother seemed uneasy and never once tried to pass Jane any of the little signals they had: the touched lip, the lifted eyebrow, the crooked finger, all that meant "honey darling," or "I love you," or "consider yourself kissed." Jane, burdened by her secret, was even more awkward than usual, and when she was eating her blueberry pie, she dropped a forkful of it on the table. "This," said Grandmother, "might have been excused in a child of 5. It is absolutely inexcusable in a girl of your age. Blueberry stains is almost impossible to get out, and this is one of my best tablecloths. But of course that is a matter of small importance." Jane gazed at the table in dismay. How such a little bit of pie could have spread itself over so much territory she could not understand. And of course it had to be at this inauspicious moment that a little furry creature escaped the pursuing Mary, skittered across the dining room, and bounded into Jane's lap. Jane's heart descended into her boots. "Where did that cat come from?" demanded Grandmother. "I mustn't be a coward," thought Jane desperately. "I found it on the street and brought it in," she said bravely. Defiantly, Grandmother thought. "It was so cold and hungry. Look how thin it is, Grandmother. Please may I keep it? It's such a darling. I won't let it trouble you. I'll—" "My dear Victoria, don't be ridiculous. I really suppose you know that we do not keep cats here. Be good enough to put that creature out at once." "Oh, no, not out in the street, Grandmother. Please, listen to the sleet. It would die." "I expect you to obey me without argument, Victoria. You cannot have your own way all the time. Other people's wishes must be considered occasionally. Please oblige me by making no further fuss over a trifle." "Grandmother," began Jane passionately, but Grandmother lifted a tiny, wrinkled, sparkling hand. Now, don't work yourself into a state, Victoria. Take that thing out at once." Jane took the kitten to the kitchen. "Don't worry, Miss Victoria. I'll get Frank to put it in the garage with a rug to lie on. It'll be quite comfy, and tomorrow I'll find it a good home for it at my sister's. She's fond of cats." Jane never cried, so she was not crying when Mother slipped rather stealthily into her room for a good-night kiss. She was only tense with rebellion. "Mummy, I wish we could get away, just you and I. I hate this place, Mummy. I hate it." And Mother said a strange thing and said it bitterly. There is no escape for either of us now. End of chapter 6.